Filippo Grandi, thank you so much for joining us on UpFront. I'd like to start by asking you, what's the relationship between the climate change that we see and migration?
It's simple, in a way, to define. The climate change, the climate emergency forces people to move. So there's an element of displacement, of forced displacement, that is linked in many, sometimes complex ways to the big climate change process that we are witnessing. Think of a big flood or a big drought even. Those phenomena which are increasing with climate change. They've always existed, but they're increasing. They're becoming more serious, more impactful with climate change. They force people to move, sometimes suddenly. But it's really the combination of factors that makes this phenomenon complex and of great relevance to my organization. Look, in many places, climate change is depleting resources, is taking resources away from very poor communities. And communities with less resources start fighting. This generates conflicts, which generate displacement of a type that is very, very germane to the work of my organization. These are fundamentally refugees that flee also because of climate change, but not only because of that.
One of the challenges is that there are no legal protections currently in place for people who are forced to leave their countries for climate change. That's because they don't fall under the definition of a refugee based on the UN's 1951 Convention on Refugees. Yet estimates state that there could be between 25 million to 1 billion environmental refugees by the year 2050. What is UNHCR doing to ensure that these people get rights and protections?
Well, you know, the issue of definitions is very complicated, and we have to be careful in this world in which very often refugees are stigmatized. So I, as the head of an organization that is the custodian of the basic refugee protection principle, have to be careful. We wouldn't say, you know, we don't use this definition that is sometimes used these days, climate refugees. But this is not to say that people that are moving because of climatic reasons do not have what we would call protection needs. Very similar to refugees. And sometimes actually they are refugees, as I said, because mixed with the causes of displacement is conflict, is discrimination, is persecution, and so forth.
Would they not experience greater protection, though, if they were considered to be climate refugees? Could you explain sort of why they're not and why they don't satisfy the conditions for being refugees simply based on being pushed out via the climate?
Look, it's also good when we talk about this to do a bit of a reality check. Most people displaced for climatic reasons are displaced actually within their countries. They're what we would call internally displaced people. Now, like I said, also, most of the people that flee across borders, there's other reasons that get in the mix. For example, war, conflict, intercommunal clashes. So we can consider them refugees in those cases, and all the protection applying to refugees apply in that sense. Of course, if people flee,
so why not just update the convention, though?
Well, because, you know, like I said, we have to be careful about definition. Expanding the definition, for example, to people who flee purely because of a natural disaster would jeopardize the definition in other cases where we need to maintain it, if you see what I mean. So we need to be careful about that. But let me stress again, there's not only refugee protection that applies to people on the move. There's humanitarian considerations. There's many other formulas that we have tested in many situations that can apply for people fleeing purely for climatic reasons. And I think that this would be the case in some of these examples that we're talking about here. So I wouldn't worry too much about the definitions. In fact, I would worry, or I would be focusing on the fact that states need to provide protection to people that are on the move.
In 2019, UN Special Rapporteur Philip Alston said that we are risking what he called climate apartheid scenario. where the wealthy can pay to escape overheating, hunger, conflict, where the rest of the world is left to suffer. Do you agree with this statement? And how will climate migration differ for those who have and those who don't have access to resources?
Look, this injustice, this lack of equity is so obvious today. We see it in every field, right? Look at the vaccinations for COVID vaccinations, this huge imbalance. Look at my field, refugees. You know, a lot of countries say we will pay poor countries to keep refugees there. No burden sharing, no responsibility sharing. So this applies, of course, also to climate. All these global challenges, including responding to the climate emergency, have to be founded on a principle that we in our field called responsibility sharing, right? In which we all try to take part of that burden. And it cannot only be done by paying. It has to be done directly. It has to be done in the first person. And I think that this applies to every type of migration as well.
Europe and the U.S. are both investing heavily in border militarization to stop the flow of climate migrants. And frankly, it's big business as well, particularly for the defense industry. Christian Parenti compares militarized responses to what he called an armed lifeboat, where rich nations adapt to the climate crisis through exclusion and violence, he says. What would you say to that?
This is one of the issues that I think is most worrying. The response to the global migration phenomenon, whatever the causes, right, including climate, on the part of the rich countries has been essentially to shut down, to separate, to push back. And we see it especially in rich countries. We see it in Europe. We see it in North America. We have seen it for many years in Australia. And this is bad in so many and wrong in so many different ways. Because first of all, it doesn't allow the burden sharing that I have spoken about. It doesn't allow people in need of protection to access the territory of countries where they have the right to seek that protection. And frankly, it sends a very, very bad message to countries that are hosting, that are receiving the vast majority of people on the move, who will start saying, well, if rich countries close borders, why should I not close my borders as well? And we already see it here and there in the global south. And you know, in a world that is going, unfortunately, towards more displacement, not less displacement, including because of climate, this is a very, very worrying and disturbing trend.
I want to switch gears a bit and talk a bit about some of the other crises going on around the world. You were recently in Afghanistan, so let's start there. Last year, international aid to Afghanistan accounted for almost 43% of the country's GDP. Then the Taliban took power. Large donors like the World Bank and the IMF have cut funds to Afghanistan, and the economy is now collapsing. The UN has just warned that more than half of the population is facing acute hunger. And the head of the World Food Program stated that millions will be forced to choose between migration and starvation. What needs to be done to protect Afghans during this crisis?
I think two things. One is straightforward, and the other one is more complex. The straightforward thing is that before winter, and we only have a few weeks left, we need to step up dramatically humanitarian assistance in the country. It's a matter of getting more resources in. But then there is the other issue, and this is what you alluded to. The state doesn't function because it's not only the World Bank and the IMF. In fact, all development assistance has been frozen because of the arrival and the taking power by the Taliban. So I have said many times during my visit there and afterwards, everybody has to make a step in each other's direction. You know, the Taliban, of course, have to get their act together, have to give assurances that fundamental issues are addressed. The rights of minorities, women able to work, girls in schools. These are important demands by the international community, and I think that there are demands by the Afghan people. And the international community needs to realize that there's no plan B here. There's not going to be another war dislodging the Taliban. They need to work with these de facto authorities, and they need to help them make the state function, because otherwise, if salaries are not paid in the health sector, for example, if the public system doesn't work, then this country will implode. This is more than a humanitarian crisis, and it is likely to provoke massive movement of people in search of better conditions abroad.
You have said recently, in fact, that you've seen encouraging signals with regard to dealing directly with the Taliban. What are the encouraging signals?
Well, I think that also compared with their first time in power in the 90s, I remember I visited there during that time. There is much more openness to discuss the issues that I have mentioned, which are the complex issues, the issues of rights, basically, of rights of women, of rights of minorities, and so forth. There is more openness. We haven't seen yet sweeping positive decisions, but we've seen, here and there openings, and certainly the discussion continues. They are ready for engagement, and I think the international community has to be ready for engagement as well, because I think it's in everybody's interest, the Taliban, the international community, but above all, the Afghan themselves, that this country is kept on the right path, because its collapse, its implosion would be extremely worrying in so many ways. You've seen the rise of terrorism already, anti-Taliban terrorism at this point, and this is a little bit a preview of things to come if things are not handled properly.
You talk about the international community, but Amnesty International says, since assuming control of Afghanistan, we have already seen a wave of violations, from reprisal attacks and restrictions on women to crackdowns on protests, the media, and civil society. With that idea in mind, with those realities in mind, do you have any misgivings, any hesitations about directly engaging the Taliban?
Of course, I am not suggesting for a moment that this is easy. And I do not think that what I and many others in the UN are suggesting, engagement, should be simply one-sided, meaning the donor community funding the Taliban. I'm not suggesting that. I'm suggesting joint work, or coming together in the middle between the demands that the international community is asking the Taliban, is putting to the Taliban, and what the Taliban decide to do. Of course, it is unthinkable that donor will fund, for example, the education system if girls cannot go to school. And I think it should be like that. So I think that it's important to be pragmatic, but it is also important to uphold some fundamental principle for the sake of the Afghans themselves.
United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, thank you so much for joining us on UpFront.
Thank you.
That's our show. UpFront will be back next week.